Hi, this is Alex. In this video, I'm going to paint a still life with some wine and a piece of cheese, and I'm going to be using oil paint. You saw the reference if you wanted to follow along or paint on your own. The only difference is that once I started painting, I took out the cork and just painted the wine and cheese. I wasn't really feeling the composition with the cork. But you can paint it any way you want. Anyway, so what I'm doing now is kind of moving my brush, just kind of hovering above the canvas for a while, as if I'm drawing, but without actually touching the panel. And that helps me to kind of establish where things are going to go. Kind of almost like a practice run before you actually put down any paint. It really helps to, sort of visualize where things are going to be. And today I'm using a tinted panel. This is just MDF board that I gessoed, and then what I do is I scrape off the paint off my palette at the end of a session and just rub it into one of the panels, and that gives me a nice sort of little base to kind of go from. And this initial drawing I'm using ultramarine blue with a little bit of linseed oil. And you can use any other color you want. You can use burnt umber, anything that's going to give you a nice mark. I thought it'd be nice to use ultramarine blue because the panel is tinted brown, and so it'll create a nice little base for the drawing, kind of a nice cool color in the edges between objects. So in this case, I kind of got the drawing nailed down pretty quickly, and I didn't really have to erase and change my placement of the objects. But if you make mistakes, this is the time to make corrections. It's very easy to erase things and redraw them, and it's better to do it now than later on. And I often do that in this stage, and sometimes erase it 2 or 3 times before I get to a place where I like. So I'm just sort of defining where my areas of color are gonna go, and with this glass, these ridges are going to become really important because they there's not going to be a very good definition between them, but it's going to be important to show where they are in certain ways. So I'm sort of defining them where they are for myself, more or less, at this stage. And in case anybody's interested, this is a Cambozola. That's the type of cheese. It's kind of a mix between a blue and a brie cheese. One of my favorites. And a Cabernet in the glass. So after I finish this still life, I'm going to have a little treat. But first I got to earn my paycheck. So now I'm going to get some ultramarine blue, burnt umber, alizarin crimson. And that's going to be my my darkest parts of the glass of the wine. And these kind of forward-facing areas are pretty much the darkest. And I'm not trying to be too precise right now, just kind of blocking things in and keeping the paint sort of relatively thin still. because I want to be able to go over it and adjust it later on. And this is a pretty thick bristle brush. I'm not sure the number, but probably somewhere in the teens. It's kind of an old brush. Can't really read the writing on it anymore. So now I'm cooling off that color a little bit and lightening it to create some highlights. I'm just adding a little white and some yellow ochre and some blue to it. And that color is especially pronounced when it's on the facets that are facing kind of away, sideways towards us on the edges, because then there's a lot of the white wall in the background that gets reflected in them. So I'm gonna mix up some more of that color and make it even lighter and cooler. And it actually doesn't look like much right now, but once I put in the background color, it begins to gel more. There's some really interesting things happening with the refraction of the glass and the way the wine is visible through the clear part of the glass. Sort of the far edge of the wine being kind of bent and refracted. So that's going to be a fun little challenge to paint. And also it has a lot of that the white wall behind it reflecting in it as well, so it's going to be fun too. So now I'm mixing up a color for the cutting board that these objects are sitting on, and that's just a dark brown that I used burnt sienna, some burnt umber, yellow ochre, and whatever was left on my brush. So it's got a little bit of a purplish tinge to it as well. And adding a little bit of alizarin crimson and yellow ochre to the front-facing edge a little bit here. It's not front-facing edge, it's sort of the foreground plane. And that's just because I'm kind of seeing those changes in color as they, as the light falls on them differently. And just making little adjustments as it's towards the back. There's a little bit more of the white wall gets reflected in it, so I'm bringing more white to it. So next I'm going to work on the cheese color. One of the interesting things about this setup is the many different whites that exist in this composition. So we have the cut side of the cheese, the top side of the cheese, the napkin, and the background wall, all of which are slightly different kinds of white. So this white is going to be kind of a creamy yellowish white, very warm, and I'm using some yellow ochre, some cad yellow, and I'm going between like the yellows, the reds, and the blues to try to find the right color until I kind of land something that's right color and the right tonal value. So the more of those colors that I put in there, the darker it's going to get. And sort of the right balance between those colors will give me more of a neutral color, and then I can push it more towards the yellow with a little bit more yellows, or a little bit more towards the red with the burnt sienna, or more cool it down more with the ultramarine blue. And the even within that color itself, there are different areas that are different colors. So now I'm mixing up a little bit darker color, again going between those three colors, and this would be sort of for the shadow. There's a slight shadow area where the surface is a little bit turned, and so there's a little bit of less light falling on there. So I'm trying to capture all those things right at this very beginning stage. And there's a lot of variety in color there, so I just have to keep mixing, keep adding new variations, and as I see them. That's the sound of my furnace firing up. I'm painting so far kind of sort of very accurately and precisely and without too much expression and chaos. And you know, there's different ways of painting. Sometimes you feel a little bit more kind of energetic, or you know, and you know, the painting will reflect kind of how you feel. In this case, I'm feeling kind of subdued and a bit chill, I guess, and so that's kind of reflected in my brush strokes. Sometimes you feel like you want to just attack the canvas and drop paint here and there, you know, without too much respect for where things go at first, and just get some color on the canvas and then go from there. And a lot of times that way you get, you know, you get a pretty interesting and fresh approach. And you know, sometimes you just want to get things in the right place, and you know, sort of like with these individual strokes kind of define exactly where things are. And I think that this way is good for kind of learning in these kind of videos, you know, because the result comes out convincing and it can be kind of explained, and there's not a lot of mystery to how things happen. But I do like to go into kind of that bit of a wild trance that happens when you completely lose yourself in a painting process. Anyway, you kind of go with what, you know, the state that you're in, so you can't really fake it. You know, you can't go bonkers and wild and expressive when you're not feeling it. Anyway, getting back to kind of what I'm doing, the top of this cheese the color is much lighter, and it has a little bit of kind of a warm spot towards the outside of the rind. And now I'm going to create a color for the background, and it's white, but it's not, conceptually it's white, but when you look at it, you have to kind of decide, what, or try to see what temperature it kind of goes towards. Is it more of a cool color? Is it more of a warm color? In this case, I'm seeing a lot more cool colors, and I think that's going to also create some nice space between the warmth of the cheese and the background. So as I'm applying it, I kind of want to try to compare to the color of that cheese. And as I'm looking at it, I want to make sure it's not too dark, it's not too light, kind of right in the right general range. And if it's not right, then I'm gonna mix up some more paint and then adjust it. And the most important thing is kind of the tonal value, like how dark or light it is. And once that color is on, then I might have to adjust some of the other things on the painting to kind of play along with that color, with that tone. So I'm creating a little bit more of a kind of a purple tinge to that color, because I feel like it needs to play a little nicer with the glass, because the glass has a lot of dark reds and purples in it. And so I want to bring a little bit of those colors into the background as well. And here comes that energetic brush strokes that I was talking about. Bring a little bit of violence and chaos into the background. And I used to use a palette knife and just mix up a whole bunch of my background color. And I've stopped doing that because I find that it's a little bit more interesting. Like I get more interesting results if I just keep mixing the paint. It's not always the same paint, and there's some variation, there's some little variety in the colors. And as the color of the background passes through the glass, it gets a little bit darker. Not a lot, and what I'm putting down is probably a little too dark. And I'll have to adjust it later, but somewhere close to that. In the end, it has to be convincing that you can see through that glass and see that wall on the other side. You can see from my reference photo that I'm probably a little too dark. If you take a look at the reference photo and you kind of squint, you begin to see that the kind of the tonal value between the wall and the clear part of the glass. And what I have is definitely way too dark. But it's a start, and we can kind of go from there. It's good to kind of fill in the background altogether, so there's not much of that toned color of the panel left. Sort of helps to put things in perspective and compare a little bit better. And this big brush, even though it's pretty wide and very kind of gruff, because you can develop that little edge to it, you can actually use it to help refine your drawing a little bit. So that's what I was doing there with kind of going around the glass. And because I do have that tone panel, things that I leave behind are now white and actually serve kind of as a drawing. So now that I have, a lot of my color covered in the background, I decided to go a little bit more towards the purple and less towards the green back there. Still a cool color and still kind of plays nicely with the cheese, but a little bit further away from that family. Get a little bit more white, kind of running out of that. And I kind of like to have a little bit more luminance towards in the background around the objects. Kind of gives them a bit of a focal point, a little bit of attention. Kind of that a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer. Almost like making them feel like they're glowing. Now that top part of the wine that you can see through the glass, but also sort of reflects the wall behind. Because of I guess it's because of the surface tension, the wine kind of comes up the glass and you can kind of see through it much more, so it's a little thinner. And so it's a lot more red. And so I used some like almost pure alizarin crimson to create that line up there. And the surface of the wine on top, because it reflects a lot of light from the wall behind it, that's a much lighter color. It's almost like a kind of a pink, kind of a pale pink. And one other thing that's kind of interesting about that area that I want to point out is that if you look at that oval that forms the top of the glass, you can kind of see the sort of the white of the wall coming around the oval, around the kind of the bottom, the left and right edges, and kind of coming into the bottom. I think it's because of refraction. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of interesting. I definitely want to capture that and maybe even exaggerate it a little bit for effect. So I'm mixing up a color that's kind of similar to the color of the transparent glass there. I'm going to bring some of that color in and around that oval. It's one of those things that it doesn't really make sense unless you actually see it. And that's why you gotta paint from life as much as you can. Because on a photograph you might be, you might notice it, you might not notice it, but when you're painting from life, you tend to kind of move your head around and see things from slightly different angles, and you wind up seeing much more of what you're painting. And this I'm painting from life, even though I'm showing the photograph of what I'm painting. Generally still lives there's kind of no reason to not paint from life. They don't move around, they're readily available, and you really do see much more when you're painting from life than from a photograph. So I encourage you to do that yourself. Certain things you have to use a photograph, of course, but try and paint from life as much as possible, and draw. I would also say that if you're just starting out, don't worry too much about creating art. You know, you can spend a long time just trying to make things look convincing on a flat surface using paint. And, you know, it's not art necessarily, but I think that the more you do that, the more you kind of train your eyes and your hands to, you know, to create things on a flat surface that look like something, the more it becomes, this act becomes more of a instinctual. It's and it's kind of necessary to kind of put in your hours and to put in some time to study these things before you can, you know, call yourself an artist or create sort of, you know, what people think of as great art. And don't get me wrong, I'm not calling myself a great artist by any means. You know, I don't even know whether painting still lifes can be considered art. But you kind of just have to keep painting and keep creating things, you know, on flat surfaces. Because, you know, eventually, when things become a little bit more second nature, when you can kind of instinctually do things on canvas and instinctually sort of create things that you will sort of, even before you do them, you know what they're going to look like. And then you're going to begin to make some kind of discoveries. And, you know, in certain cases, you'll start painting and you'll find that something works a certain way. And, you know, somewhere within that kind of moment of discovery, you know, something that you didn't know before, some kind of a truth that you uncover while you're painting, during the act of painting, somewhere within there lies something close to art. But you are not going to find it if you're just, you know, while you're still struggling to, you know, find technique, or while you're struggling to figure out how things work, or how to control things, how to control paint. Those things have to kind of become second nature before you know, have some hope of discovering something interesting and something true in this act of painting. And, you know, I'm certainly not teaching you how to do art. I'm teaching you here how to create, you know, convincing visuals with paint. And, you know, you can take that as a starting point and create something with it. You know, I hope it's helpful. I hope that, you know, watching my videos and watching me paint gives you some insight and gives you some inspiration and gets you in front of a canvas or in front of a panel with some paints, creating your own work. That's all I can say, is just continue making your own paintings, and somewhere along that journey, you know, things will begin to happen. I'm still discovering things myself. You know,
certainly nowhere near the finish line or any kind of crescendo in my art. But every time I paint, I try to discover something interesting, discover something new, and sometimes I don't. But when you do, when you're able to sort of gel things together and find the right colors and the right composition, that as you're looking at your painting, it makes you happy, then it's worth it. And then there's that's when I call a painting successful. But as I said, you have to kind of put in your hours and put in your time and do the work in order to feel it.
Anyway, getting back to the painting. Not a lot has happened since my rant, but I guess I've painted in this napkin that the cheese is on. And the napkin is white. It's probably the whitest thing in this painting right now. But it still isn't pure white. I added in some blue and some yellow to tone it down. Because nothing is completely white. If you look at a subject, if you look at the still life, the things that are getting close to white are going to be the reflections, the kind of the highlights where the light from from the lamp or from the sun is reflecting directly into your eyes. Like that'll come close to white. Everything else is going to be a few tones down from that. But the way you make things look white is you surround them by darker things, so that that cheese is darker, that board that everything's on is darker, and so that kind of light bluish gray that I put down for the napkin really feels bright and white. Now there's this part of the glass kind of at the bottom where it's actually one of the most interesting parts of the glass is that this is where a lot of light kind of gets in underneath the wine. So there's all kinds of interesting kind of colors. There's a little bit more of a greenish tone to the glass because it's the thickest part of the glass on the glass. And I'm kind of following the facets, following the pattern of the shape of the glass, and then just trying to sort of notice some colors and add them in as I see them. This is where a little bit of faith goes a long way. Sometimes you might put some things down there and they just don't look right, or you may not think that they'll come out to something. But as long as you're sort of honest with what you're putting down, if you get the other colors around it right, and especially the tonal values, then in the end it will look like what you're trying to depict. Sometimes it doesn't make sense why it looks the way it does, but in the end it kind of comes together. So just kind of trying to adjust things a little bit, getting my horizon line in place. It's also kind of interesting to see how similar the colors are between the background and the cheese. Sometimes those are, it's something interesting to look for. How can you get the tonal values like almost the same, and still there is a clear sort of separation between the two objects. So that dark part of the glass right now is looking a little too dark, a little too simple. So I'm going to go in there and start to refine things a little bit. Now that I have paint pretty much everywhere on the panel, now it's time to go in and begin some details. And I'm about halfway into the painting, so it's kind of more or less the breakdown that I like, is that you spend half of the time establishing the sort of the spots. Look for the general areas of color and value, and then you can spend the rest of the time honing in some of those details. Of course, the detail part can last much longer if you want to become, if you want the painting to be much more realistic, but sort of the way that I paint is I want to get a certain amount of detail that kind of creates enough interest without getting bogged down by details. This glass is actually kind of tricky because the facets are not really visible that well in the the final thing that you see, but you just sort of know that they're there. So you can't really outline them and just because then it'll look amateurish. It won't look real. So you have to keep them in mind while trying to capture the kind of the nuance as the the facets turn from one side to the other. And here I try to add a little bit of that brown from the table, which is reflected in that facet. But the first color that I put down was too strong. It was too blunt. So I had to correct that. There's some places down there in the bottom that are very bright. There's like little concentrations of light, even kind of like a little bit of yellow, green peeking through here and there. So I'm dropping some of those in there. I'm just trying to be conscious of not going too far and not disrupting what's what's already there, and not really trying to draw too much attention to an area that I don't want to be noticed that much. And then there's some reflections coming off of the cheese in the glass, and those become a little bit brighter. And then the top of that facet is lighter compared to the sort of the flat part or the round part of the glass, which then reads a little bit darker. Kind of a lot of little subtle things that in the end hopefully will pay off. And then all the way on the edge there's that other facet that is facing almost to the wall, and so it's, because of its angle, it's catching a lot of that light from the wall and then reflecting it back at us. And those facets, they almost melt into the background, which is kind of cool too. Pretty interesting. And then there's a little bit of brown that gets reflected off of the table back there too. So some of the some of the wall begins to get covered up by the table, and so that reflection changes, the color of the reflection changes. This is kind of fun part, just adding the blue dots on the cheese. And I'm not necessarily, I'm trying to stick to more or less where they are, but I'm also designing it a little bit, trying to kind of create a pattern that's pleasing. And it's not a bright blue, it's more of a kind of a bluish gray. So you don't want to go too rough with the color. I'm kind of alternating between the ultramarine blue, some yellow ochre, some cad yellow, and white. And it's okay to go a little bit stronger because there's still that kind of cream color underneath, which is going to naturally mix into your paint and soften those colors a little bit, but it's good to be close. And at first I'm putting down just patches of color, and then later I'll go in and add a little bit of lighter color that's sort of created by that mold in the cheese. And I think that this is coming out pretty nicely, actually, that the contrast between the cream color of the cheese and the blue really sort of nails those colors, and it sort of makes them both feel more vibrant than they actually are. Now, across the top edge of that cheese, there's some it's a little bit of kind of ridges that are formed with a little bit of a darker color. So I'm just putting those in, just little indications of them. And it's okay that there is a little bit of that background color still left. It actually kind of serves as a bit of a drawing line here and there that I think helps. And then along that top edge, there's a little bit of a shadow. There's a little bit of, tiny bit of a lip kind of hanging over. So now I think it's time probably to address that glass. As I was saying, that it feels a little dark, so I'm just taking that background color and adding a little bit of that in the middle, sort of the thinnest parts of the glass, or the parts where you see you have the least amount of distortion from the glass. And even with just that little bit, it begins to look much more transparent. Now I also want to sort of pick apart that shadow behind the glass a little bit more. There's some interesting things happening there too, because it's not just one kind of solid brown shape, but there's a little bit of that wall being reflected off of that shadow and changing its color a little bit as well. So it's another little interesting little bit that I want to play around with and try to get it right. It might be kind of a subtle thing that's hard to tell in the video, but it is interesting, and it's kind of nice to create these little areas within your painting for people to dive in a little deeper and kind of spend a little bit more time on the painting and discover things on their own. And it's got to be subtle, it can't be too abrupt. I always have this problem with getting the horizon line sort of in a nice straight line. I always wind up messing something up. Sometimes it's actually, I feel like I should just get a ruler and just paint it in. So now I'm putting some highlights on the glass, and this is probably one of the last things you want to do is get that, really bright light color that's almost white. In this case, I'm using slightly cooler colors, sort of similar to what's on the napkin, because it's not a direct highlight. It's not reflecting directly into your eyes, but it's sort of a little bit softened, so it's not completely white. The top edge of the wine looks a little bit cream colored to me, so I want to cool it off. So I'm just gonna bring in a little bit of ultramarine and white, and gonna give it a little touch here and there. And sometimes you just kind of look at the object and look at your painting, and if you feel like something's deficient, something's kind of in the wrong color zone or whatever, and just sometimes you can just take, sometimes what I do is just take a color that's kind of obviously in the direction that I want it to go in, and maybe a little bit too abruptly, and just kind of wipe it on top of that area and just see what happens. And sometimes that actually creates some interesting little accidents and little things that begin to happen that make sense in the long run. Like sometimes if you're painting for a long time and you're close to the painting, you sort of lose sight that you're off by some kind of color. So once in a while, get up and walk back and take a look at your painting, take a look at the subject, and find those differences that you kind of miss. And sometimes it's just this kind of rough adjustment actually works pretty well. Now I'm just adding a few reflections here and there. We're getting pretty close. I think that the painting is almost done. And I'm actually pretty happy with the way this one came out. I think it's, it's not a very energetic painting, but I think it has some very interesting things going on with color and contrast that I really, really like. Like the contrast between the wine, the table, and the cheese and the napkin in the background. Those things have a really nice kind of, to me at least, a nice kind of harmony to them, and an interplay between them. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Let me know also if this was helpful, or if I talk too much or too little, or if you want me to talk about something else. And I think that to some people it's not helpful to hear what kind of colors I'm mixing, for example. And some people have told me, like, anybody who has eyes can see what colors you're mixing. You don't need to tell them. But I think that some people have told me that that's useful, and they even ask me if I post a video without my palette. They ask me to list all the colors that I use, so I'm guessing that's useful to some people. And my palette is a little bit messy. I don't completely clean it off every time I finish painting, so there's a lot of paint left over, and sometimes I have paint on the palette that I don't really use. But just for those who are, paying attention, the colors that I used in this, or the paints that I used in this painting, were titanium white,
cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and ultramarine blue. I mean, I have some other colors on the palette, but like cadmium red and chromium green, but I didn't really use those this time around. But I feel like usually the colors that I almost always use are white, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and alizarin crimson. It's kind of my go-to palette. And then I add some colors here and there depending on the subject. I mean, if I paint a landscape, obviously I'll have some greens that I would use. Although ultramarine blue and cad yellow light make a pretty wide range of greens that you can then tone down with some reds and some other yellows too, to make different variations. All right, so I'm just finishing things up here, playing around a little bit more with that, with the facets on the glass, trying to keep it subtle but not too vague and loose. I think those highlights on the rim probably could be a little bit brighter. I already have some color there, so I'm gonna pick up some paint that's almost white, just a touch of blue in it, cool it off just a little bit. And sometimes I have this problem where, you know, paint won't stick, and really all you gotta do is just, there's two things you can do about it. You can kind of scrape off any paint that's underneath there, or just go really thick and pick up a whole bunch of paint and just dab it on there until it sticks. Just kind of the approach I usually take. And the other way to do it is kind of is dilute the paint a little bit more to make it more kind of more like ink, and that'll go over everything. But then I gotta get my thin brush and like a sable brush and use that, and kind of wanted to do this whole painting without resorting to the really thin brushes, and you have the sable brushes. And I think that was probably a good decision. It kind of came out well. The problem with using thin brushes is that you sort of become committed to a finer level of detail. I mean, they give you much more control. They allow you to make sort of much finer refinements, but once you start playing around with one area and making it, you know, giving it a certain level of detail, you kind of have to give that similar level of detail to the rest of the painting. You can't have one area that's really well kind of refined and detailed, while the rest of it is a mess. So if I do use thinner brushes, I only use them for like one thing that I have to do. Like if I need to put on a highlight, I'll do that, but I won't go in and start, you know, refining those blue dots and making them all perfect. There's a little bit of that shadow underneath the napkin that helps to make it look a little bit more real. Kind of looking back at this painting, I realized that I could have probably done a little bit more to the surface of that napkin. It's a little simple. Kind of feels a little bit more kind of stuck on and not really worked into the painting, but I do like the contrast that it creates with the rest of the objects. But I think a little bit of variation, maybe a little bit of interplay between warms and cools could be interesting. Maybe where, you know, closer to the cheese, there's a little bit more of that warm tone could reflect into the napkin a little bit. Maybe next time. All right, I think this painting is just about done. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. It really helps the channel. Leave comments as well. Let me know whether you liked this video, whether you liked this painting, or if you didn't. I'm fine hearing about it either way. But subscribe and turn on the little notification, because whenever I post new videos, you can watch them sort of premiere on my channel. I know I haven't posted in a little while, but that's only because I've been busy painting, and so I have all these videos that I shot of myself painting, but I don't have any time to add commentary or edit them in any way. So as I find time, I'll be posting much more of these. So if you follow me on my Instagram channel, which is at LXNYC, you can sort of track my progress a little bit more closely. I tend to post things there right after I paint, because things don't require as much editing as they do on YouTube. So anyway, subscribe to my Instagram channel as well, and I hope to see you soon. Please come back and check out more of my videos. All right, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.